Welcome, everybody. My name is Francois Kunz. I'm a long-time member of Catalyst, and it's my privilege to be standing in for Susan Eichhorn this evening, who's unable to be with us due to a family commitment. So welcome to Spirituality on the Sofa. Tonight's topic is synodality, a new path for the church. And there is a question mark, so we'll be interested to see what our speakers make of the question mark in the topic, if anything. And we are privileged tonight to have two, I think, of the outstanding speakers in the Anglophone world on the topic of the Synod and the Synodality in the form of Professor Anna Rowlands and Dr Austen Ivereigh, and I'll say a bit more about them in a moment. Can I begin by reminding us of those beautiful words in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where we acknowledge the unbroken spiritual sovereignty of our Indigenous brothers and sisters over this land? And can I invite you all to reflect for a moment how the Spirit might inspire you to help make their lives better in the very challenging circumstances in which they unjustly continue to find themselves in our country. So our first speaker, as they have decided to divide the evening up between them, is Professor Anna Rowlands, British theologian and academic. She specialises in Catholic social teaching and contemporary Catholic theology, is currently the St Hilda Professor of Catholic Social Thought and Practice at Durham University. But very relevantly for tonight's purposes, she was seconded to the Holy See in 2023 to assist with the Synod on Synodality, and has been appointed not to one but two Vatican dicasteries, remembering that bilocation was once taken as a sign of sanctity, to help with their research on matters of politics, economics, climate, and migration. So it gives me great pleasure to hand the floor over to Anna.
Thank you, Francois, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation this evening. It's always a joy to be part of a conversation that involves Austin as well, so I'm particularly pleased to be sharing the slot with him this evening. I have great and fond memories of my trip to Sydney, as we were just saying, just before the pandemic, so I feel as if I am amongst friends this evening / this morning. So without further ado, I've got a kind of reasonably formal lecture to make sure that I stick to the time slot, which is partly written especially around your title that you give me for this evening, and also draws on some work that I'm doing for a book chapter to honour the papacy of Pope Francis. And my chapter is on synodality, so I've drawn a little bit from that as well. So here we go. In an Italian secular newspaper article published in October 2024, church historian Alberto Maloney argued, quote, "To have surmised that the game of the post-conciliar church was synodality is the credit that history will give to Pope Francis." End of quote. What's striking about Maloney's judgment that this is the credit that history would give to Pope Francis is that he himself, Maloney, was no cheerleader for the synod process. He was quite openly critical. Nonetheless, Maloney is absolutely clear that to understand the ambition of the synodal process and its central concept, the slightly difficult to digest synodality, is to grasp its umbilical connection to the conciliar vision of the Second Vatican Council. True, but we should also add to this otherwise helpful point the equal importance to Pope Francis's synodal vision of the practices and dispositions of the early church, the earliest expression of a community of, quote, communion, participation and mission, to draw on those three watchwords of the synodal process, to reconnect us to the dynamic memory of that early church was, I believe, a crucial part of how Francis saw his ministry as Bishop of Rome. Synodality can be seen, therefore, as I think, a productive and mysterious paradox. Synodality is a newness that in fact connects us to our deepest Christian memory. Synodality is about the presence of the Spirit now in both newness and in continuity. In fact, precisely weaving the connections between our Christian past, present, and future. And given, by the way, that I think we live in a moment where the deliberate attempt to break connections between past, present, and future dominates our political horizons, I think it's particularly powerful that synodality seeks to weave those connections between our Christian past, present, and future. Synodality is called to dwell as deeply as possible in the novelty of our own times, to be open to the gift of the present time, is only intelligible if we understand it to be at the same time a call to dwell as deeply as possible in the memory of our past. Precisely because Christians understand time differently from secular understandings of linear time, there is for us no contradiction here, only living springs from which we draw. To return to the figure of Pope Francis, I want to make another sort of foundational claim now at the outset. Synodality is about Pope Francis, but it is not only or foundationally about Pope Francis. I think there's a real danger of, in a sense, fusing synodality and Pope Francis in such a way that actually we end up in quite an unhelpful space. So what do I mean by saying it's about Francis, but also sort of not only about Francis? Francis went so far as to boldly claim that synodality is what God requires of the church in this age. That is a very bold claim. Yet, we should be clear that whilst Francis's papacy cannot be viewed apart from the question of its synodal process and proposal, in itself, the contemporary proposal for a synod on synodality did not, and this is really crucial and overlooked, originate with Francis alone. Nor can it be viewed credibly as an ecclesial act of will to power on his part. It's not something that Francis simply imposed on us without context. The recent origins of this synodal vision lie, I think, in a variety of sources, and they have multiple roots. And the fact that it is various sources and that there are multiple roots is a fact that gives real authenticity, I think, to the call that Francis then issued. In his opening words to the first assembly of the Synod on Synodality in 2023, which are really worth going back and reading, Francis began with a reference to Pope Paul VI and his hope, carefully expressed as a Latin church dilemma, that in the West, his belief, not hope, carefully expressed as a Latin church dilemma, that in the West, synodality had been largely lost as a defining characteristic of the church, and that it needed to be retrieved and lived. The Synod of Bishops was meant to be an organ for working towards such a retrieval when it was set up after the council. This retrieval was imagined as both a return to the dynamic synodal practice of the early centuries of the church's life and to a renewed push to implement more fully and integrally the conciliar vision of Vatican II, including its vision of episcopal collegiality. A few sentences later, in the same opening address of 2023, Francis reminds delegates that it was the bishops themselves who selected synodality as a priority topic for synodal discussion. This has got so lost, in my view, that the bishops themselves selected synodality as a priority topic for discussion. Francis said, quote, "In the survey of preferences taken among all the bishops of the world following the synod on the Amazon, the theme of synodality came in second place. In first place was the topic of priests, and in third place, I believe, there was a social issue. I think that actually was migration. But synodality came in second, because all the bishops of the world felt a need to reflect on synodality. Why? Because they all understood that the time was ripe for something like this." End of quote. So Francis saw himself, I think, as an animator of a movement towards synodality that was gaining momentum across contexts. However, a wider range of influences still, beyond the early church and Vatican II, I think have also been at play. Most frequently and credibly credited is Francis's experience of episcopal collegiality in a dynamic form and in a synodal way in Latin America. The Fifth General Conference of CHELAM, held in Aparecida in Brazil in 2007, produced not just a process but a document that inspired Francis's belief that synodality could genuinely generate greater episcopal communion at the same time as helping us to discern key social issues that shape our mission context, that synodality could help us formulate credible pathways forward and build deeper communion simultaneously. It also seems to have convinced him, and I think, again, this is really crucial, that synodality needed to be not a theory, but primarily a lived experience if it was truly to take root across highly diverse contexts. Animating experiences of synodality was, for Francis, going to be key. Apparecida forms the context, of course, then for much of what was written in Evangelii Gaudium, which in turn lays out the agenda for mission that synodality attempts to turn into a dynamic practice, a lived ecclesiology at all levels of the church. However, I think there are also other influences, including the ministry and writings of Cardinal Martini, as well as those of a lesser-known American prelate, Archbishop John Quinn. Martini famously focused on many of the themes that came to occupy Francis: deeper collegiality between the Pope and the bishops, greater participation and cooperation in mission and governance between laity and clergy, and a willingness to attend to difficult social, pastoral, and doctrinal issues, primarily through dialogue and encounter, not only through the pages of texts. These themes find an echo and a development then in Francis's own Ignatian and Romano Guardini influenced focus on listening, discernment of spirits, and deepening attention to the tensions and the knots of ecclesial life. So you can see this kind of call and response, this echo between Martini's concerns and Francis's. Martini arguably prefigured Francis's own proposal for a permanent synodal character to the Church of our times. That was a phrase that Martini used, rather than merely synodal events to punctuate the ecclesial calendar. And arguably part of the newness that we're talking about this evening is not that we use synods or that there's a synodal dimension to the church's life, but rather that it should be a permanent flow in that synodal character of the church, rather than merely synodal events to punctuate the ecclesial calendar. Meanwhile, as others have reported, whilst Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Bergoglio was also influenced by the writings of John Quinn. Quinn, ordained just before Vatican II, made its study a central part of his priestly life. He advocated for deep reforms of church governance, including greater local involvement in decisions affecting local churches, including as a key issue the selection of bishops, which of course is a topic that makes its way into the final document of the synod. Bergoglio later bumped into Quinn in a Roman cafe and reportedly informed him that he had read and greatly appreciated the book, that he shared Quinn's vision of a reformed papacy and curia and hoped that it would become a reality. This was, I think, a year before Francis's election. What's particularly striking about Quinn's vision is that it emerged in dialogue not only with Catholic sources, but with the ecumenical movement, in particular his engagement with John Paul II's Ut Unum Sint. And I want to use this as a segue to argue that I also increasingly have come to believe that ecumenism perhaps forms one of the most overlooked sources for the renewal of synodal thinking in the Catholic Church. In the major ecumenical dialogues, the question of the conciliar and collegial character, these two emphases, the conciliar and collegial character of the Church, emerged as major fruitful lines of reflection for the various ecumenical dialogues. This animated various Catholic theologians over the last 50 to 60 years to deepen their own study and presentation of these two realities, the conciliar and collegial character of the Church. In this regard, it's notable that the same sources that were animating discussions of renewal in the conciliar and post-conciliar period were also crucial for the development of the ecumenical dialogues of the same time. In this vein, American ecclesiologist Rick Galeardes, who sadly died during the synodal process, wrote strikingly about the Dominican theologian and ecumenist Jean-Marie Thiard's vision of synodality as the root for collegiality, writing, quote, "For Thiard, synodality refers to the communion that exists among the local churches, whereas collegiality refers to the communion that exists among the bishops." So he thinks that synodality is the deeper root for collegiality. So synodality refers to the communion among the local churches, collegiality refers to the communion that exists among the bishops. He adds that for Thiard, Vatican II and the later revision of canon law, and this is really important, both failed to adequately root collegiality in synodality. So one of the questions I often get asked is about the relationship between the council and synodality. Is it merely an attempt to sort of implement with a delay the full vision of the council? Somebody like TR was already pointing out through his ecumenical work that in fact the council and also the revision of canon law hadn't actually managed to adequately root collegiality in synodality, and that work remained to be done. That's one of the things I think that's being picked up now, and is the new path of synodality that helps us better to formulate some of the material that was not so adequately formulated in the council. Seemingly, rerouting this connection was precisely what Francis had in mind in the manner of gathering and the method of discerning used by the synod on synodality. People were so, I think, focused on the outcomes, particularly on hot button issues, that they, I think, didn't understand the significance always of the manner of gathering and the method of discerning that was being used and was proposed by Francis. In this sense, when Francis spoke about there being, quote, no synodality without ecumenism, one could also point out that indeed, ecumenism has been a mechanism to keep synodality in focus for Catholics, as well as being a necessary future integral commitment. In framing the discussion that follows, we can say, therefore, without risk of contradiction, that synodal practice with a missionary and reforming and renewing telos, because in the end, everything about synodality is about mission, should be seen as a defining and developing feature of the full duration of Francis's papacy, and yet this is not a focus that Francis himself originated. Rather, we might say that he made this growing, although not universally shared aspiration to synodality, his own, and he wove through it his own particular set of pastoral and theological concerns. It's a process with wider and deeper roots that came nonetheless to bear his unique imprint. And now, with Pope Leo, the imprint of another man will be part of its implementation. In this sense, I think it's poignant that Francis died at a point when the work of the assemblies was concluded, its documents signed into the ordinary magisterium of the Church, and the task returned to the local churches, acknowledging as a proviso that there is also work for the Curia to do and that the study groups have yet to report. Having situated a little of that context, the kind of some of the foundational orientations that I think generally help us to have this conversation, I want to use my last 5 minutes to highlight 4 aspects of the document and the new path that I think it lays before us. Again, I would like to emphasise that there can be no new path for the Church that is anything other than a form of return. This is the fruitful paradox of all Christian life. So first of all, I want to emphasise that the first aspect of the text that I think is crucially important to see and grasp if one wants to understand both the ancient memory of synodality and also the newness of its practice we're being called to, is the structural emphasis that the final document places on the theme of conversion. So this theme of conversion, of relationships, of structures and of bonds is the architecture, if you like, of the document. That order, the conversion of relationships, of structures and bonds, is quite important. Why? Because the Church is above all else a relational reality, and as fallible creatures and creatures orientated towards growth in virtue, we seek to repent and grow in those relationships. It's also an important order because it mirrors the threefold communion and its running order later in the text. The Church is a communion of the faithful, a communion of the local churches, which manifests in the communion of the bishops. Relationships, structures, and bonds are crucial to these 3 realities of communion that the Church is called to nurture, to care for. And attention to all 3 is a hallmark of the synodal path we're on. One of the reasons that I'm emphasising that, just to be very clear, is because much of the time that I spent in Rome in the lead up to the election of Pope Leo, so many of the conversations I had were with people who were saying to me that they were very keen on the relational side of synodality, but they didn't really think it should have anything to do with structures or processes. And I think it is impossible to read the final document and not to note that this is an integral umbilical relation between relationship structures and bonds. Secondly, the second emphasis is the emphasis on unity and diversity, and really trying to reflect on the meaning and challenge of a Christian vision of being a plural people and yet one. And again, this is not just a hallmark of the document. When you look at those discussions in Rome in the lead up to the election of Leo, a huge amount of that synodal discussion was again focused on questions of how we understand unity and diversity to relate to each other. That became a key political point of division during that time. The final document calls then for a recognition that unity is above all a divine gift, and in our created plurality of cultures, languages and traditions, what we're called to do is seek the underlying harmony, and we must open ourselves to the deepest unity. And speaking of how unity and diversity relate, there is a vision of profound receptivity that comes through the document. As Christians, we are first of all people who receive so that we might act. We do not assert that we might be. This also pertains to the characteristic practice of listening, which is not merely a therapeutic or sociological theme for synodality, but a profoundly Christocentric and pneumatological act. Whether it involves discerning pastoral needs, recognising the charisms of the Spirit poured out, engaging with the sensus fidei, listening is highlighted as the path to discernment. This echoes the example of Jesus, who asks those he encounters on the road, "What do you need? What do you want from me?" That open question from the beginning is crucial. It's also rooted in the faith of Pentecost, whereby the Spirit enables speech, but also crucially listening that leads to mutual understanding and new bonds of Christian community. The new path of synodality seeks to embed listening, whether to scripture, through prayer, to one another, or to our times, as a fundamental and permanent act within every basic or local Christian community. Fourthly, the document places an unusual but timely emphasis on what is happening to our experience of place and locality. And if there's one section of the final document that I think really brings us into the newness of our own mission context, it's the section on place and locality as it relates to mission. The document, the final document, says we're called to be firmly rooted, yet pilgrims. Our condition, yet again as Christians, is one of productive paradox that the world does not always understand. The most rooted of people, and yet always in motion towards God's kingdom. That's who we're called to be. In a more practical way, the document notes, quote, "The experience of rootedness, of being rooted as Christians, means grappling with profound socio-cultural changes that are transforming our experience of place." Focusing on themes including migration, digital cultures, globalization, the document notes that the Church is called to rebuild community with missionary creativity and to promote in this uprooted context a deep rootedness that allows for the exchange of gifts. And that theme of the exchange of gifts is again a crucial thread through the whole text. For me, these themes of engagement with place, the exchange of gifts, a commitment to a deep and profound listening and receptivity that runs throughout our way of being Christians in local places, and our understanding that our unity is a mystery that we receive in the context of created plurality and difference, opens to us a narrative, a language, a sense of who we are as a storied community that will renew, if we allow it, the relationship structures and bonds that form our basic communion. Is that a new pathway? It has newness in it, but it is utterly about the memory of who we are, and it is a renewal that is always and only a form of the deepest return. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That's very rich, and one's got to sit back and take a deep breath to appreciate the depth of what you've been talking to us about. Can I now turn to our second guest speaker, Austen Ivereigh. Austen is a well-known Catholic writer, journalist, and commentator. He is the Fellow in Contemporary Church History at Campion Hall, and I think his best claim to fame is that he is the UK's answer to Henry Thoreau, but he's not on Walden Pond. He's somewhere in the Welsh marshes, communing with nature in the spirit of Laudate Si. Austen, over to you.
Also, thank you for that lovely introduction. A joy to be with you. Amazing that we can be connected like this, even though we are on completely opposite sides of the world. I'm reminded that we're in shirts and you've got jumpers on, so it is amazing. I knew that Anna would give us something, magisterial, and she has. She speaks, of course, from right within the body of people in the synod who have been writing particularly these final documents. So it's really rich to hear from her. I really just want to it carries on quite nicely from where she ended, but I just really want to focus on something that I've come to understand more and more through this journey of the synod on synodality, and that's the key reason why the church needs it. And I think this is something that perhaps has not been explained sometimes as well as it might have been, and I've sometimes struggled to understand it. And it's rooted in what Pope Francis called, or the Aparecida document in 2007, called the change of era. The change of era that we are living through, which is now, I think, pretty commonly accepted in the church. In which one way of operating as a church, which seems so successful really until pretty recent decades, really right up until the eve of the Second Vatican Council, that way of operating, which was very much shaped by the church in modernity, is essentially collapsing. Has collapsed, is collapsing, whichever way you want to look at it, but at a very dramatic speed, and in fact at a speed that is increasing all the time. And at the same time, we're entering into, and you can see the birth of it at the moment, this new era, one that calls for a very different way of operating, and which requires a conversion, yes, of all of us as people, but also collectively of us as a culture. And that word culture is one I want to focus on, the conversion of culture, which we see capture in this expression, synodal conversion. And if I can just share, I'm going to share a few slides. I'm not very good at slides. You'll find that most of these are book covers, but here we go. The key phrase I want to offer here, which is one that Francis used more and more towards the end of his pontificate. He had this great gift of synthesizing in a sort of gnomic phrases. He talked about el estilo de Dios, lo estilo de Dio, God's style. And really, and particularly in his travels, he would constantly emphasize, look, God has a certain style, has a way of relating to us, which we are called to embody. And so I put there a couple of quotes from 2 trips he did in recent years. What is of so much of concern to us in our worldly ways, not what is concern to God, and that the church is called to reflect that. So synodality, in a sense, is a call to embody more of God's style, which is exactly what Anna was just saying. It's actually a return, it's a conversion to the gospel. It's a call to be more faithful to Christ, which is necessary because in every era the church takes on, as it were, the shape of the culture. The church is far more shaped by the culture than we seem to think. So this transition that we're going through shouldn't surprise us. If you think how different the Church of the Counter-Reformation looked from, the Byzantine Church, you'll see we are now in this shift. And each time we go through these shifts, there's a call of purification. It's the same. It is the path to which the Council called us, but for which I think the West wasn't ready in so many ways because the model seemed to be working so well into the sort of 60s and 70s, but was, I think, embraced very clearly by Latin America. Now, when I talk about culture and style, some might suggest, and Anna alluded to this, the people who say, we like this idea of a conversion of culture, but let's not talk about structures and so on. Well, of course, the two are, as she said so well, just simply interlinked. You can't escape them. The recent document approved by Pope Leo for the implementation phase of the Synod, this very exciting 3-year process we're now embarking upon, having had the 3-year Synod on synodality, which means, by the way, that we have a process that will be longer than that of the Second Vatican Council, and unlike the Council, will continue to involve the people of God at every level. So it's a remarkable thing that we are going through at the moment, a remarkable journey of conversion. But it says there in 3.2, the specific objective of this phase is to discern the steps of conversion of culture, relations, ecclesial practices, and consequently of reform of structures and institutions. You can't have one without the other. One flows from the other. But I want to just focus, because I haven't got long, on this conversion of culture, because I think that's the part that's not easily understood. Why is this culture change needed? Because of the change of era. So that's the big picture, the historical context. And it has everything to do, as Anna has already alluded to, the great meeting which produced the Francis pontificate in so many ways, and in which he was a key player, which was the meeting of the Latin American bishops at the Brazilian shrine of Aparecida in May 2007, where the Latin American Church, for the first time in 25 years, comes together and conducts this profound discernment of the signs of the times, understands this cambio de época, this change of era, in a way that I think no other church has, or rather, more importantly, understood the way that the church was being called to respond to it better than the church in anywhere else in the world. And Latin America, so we wouldn't be having this conversation now. We wouldn't even be talking about the Synod on Synodality were it not for Pope Francis. But Pope Francis wouldn't have been talking about it were it not for the Latin American Church's reception of Vatican II. So, that's why Anna's right to say this is all about Francis, but it's also not. There's a bigger picture involved. So Latin America, as the most synodal of our particular churches, remains the laboratory, the engine of synodality. And of course, right now, particularly in Latin America, what's happening in Amazonia. I know you've got in Australia with you at the moment Mauricio Lopez, who's been a key figure in this, the creation of this remarkable body called the Ecclesial Conference of the Amazon. Ecclesial Conference, not Bishops' Conference, Ecclesial Conference, involving whole new ways of being and ways of operating, strong involvement. It's a mixture of bishops and lay people and religious. Again, you can see that they are leading the way in so many ways. And can I just say, incidentally, by the way, that Latin America has undergone this synodal conversion. So have you in Australia. And I don't know whether Anna would agree with this, but I was quite struck at the synod, the last two assemblies of the synods of bishops. You could see that in the Latin Americans and in the Australians who were there, the way they collaborated with each other. They were real teams. They constantly met together, they deliberated together. There was no real difference in that sense between the bishops and the lay people and the religious. I think in stark contrast really to so many of the other churches, particularly mine. You can just see that there has been a change in the habits. And the Australian church, I think, is the other church, apart from the Latin American church, which exhibits this. So just to go back to Aparecida, of course, the great contribution of Aparecida, led by Cardinal Bergoglio, was to understand how the church was called to respond in this change of era. That the change of era was that essentially Christianity was ceasing to be a religio, a source of identity supported by law and culture, that the institutions which traditionally transmitted faith, that's to say, family and parish and school and so on, no longer did. And we know that from the lack of young people in our churches. So everybody agrees about this rupture in the transmission of faith. The question is then, what is the church called to do? What is the Spirit asking of the church? And this is the big shift in Aparecida, that the collapse of cultural Catholicism, the loss of institutional prestige, was actually an invitation to conversion. And the Francis pontificate, so having done that discernment in Aparecida, and Aparecida lays out a whole vision for how the church needs to change to become more apostolic, more missionary, more synodal, more humble, there's a whole load of series of ways in which it needs to change. The Francis pontificate essentially was designed to enable that conversion, with synodality at the conclusion of the pontificate being the primary means of doing so. And the key thing that the Latin American bishops did at Aparecida, and I've written about this a lot, was that unlike the church in Europe and America, which looked at secularization and saw the threat and tried to cling on and how do we get back to what we had and so on, the Latin American bishop says, how is the Holy Spirit asking us to change in order to carry out our mission in this new context? And this is essentially the synod question. It's the one that you began your plenary council with. What is the Holy Spirit asking of the church? That in itself, that move, that action of turning in humility to the Spirit, so how must we change in order to carry out Jesus' mission, is in itself a remarkable kind of shift from a model where, as it were, the church holds the truth, contains the truth, and its job is to simply communicate that truth. So elected Pope in 2013, Francis reformulates Aparecida in Evangelii Gaudium, which provides this roadmap for the conversion of the church. And you can read the pontificate as a decisive move to bring about that change of culture in a way that was very, very disruptive, stimulating, captivating, exciting, all the things that Francis was. but it was above all about communicating a way of being. It's humble, discerning, pastoral, ecological, synodal, fraternal, missionary, which was, of course, captivating because it embodied in so many ways the way God's style, the way Jesus relates to us. And I think the presenting issue in the conclave, and here I completely want to back up what Anna was saying. I was there too, and talking to cardinals and so on. It was very, very clear that while there was a small portion of cardinals who wanted to reverse this direction, the clear majority wanted to continue that course and to deepen the direction, in fact, that Francis had set. Hence the Leo election, and the media failed to predict and understand. Sorry, I shouldn't say the media, I'm part of it. So many in the media fail to foresee the Prévost election because they were stuck in this idea that the cardinals were arguing about doctrine, liberals versus conservatives. Actually, the doctrinal questions in the church are largely settled, even if not resolved. That's to say, that's not the fundamental division. What was at issue at the conclave was, again, Anna said it, the style of church, how it relates to the world, how it sees itself. And this is very clear, by the way, from a book by a friend of both mine and Anna's. I'm sure many of you know him. He's been in Australia as well. Chris White has this really very, very good little book, which has just come out, sort of Insta book explaining the conclave and the election of Leo. And he puts synodality absolutely at the heart of that, because synodality was about how the church relates internally. And so that was the central issue at the conclave, was how the next pope would continue, embed and deepen the Francis reform. So just going back now to a little bit more on the change of era and why this cultural shift is so necessary. So I've already said, what was clear at Aparecida is that we're entering into, if you like, a new apostolic era, like the very first centuries of the church. Obviously, we can't go back, but in many ways, this new era has similarities with that early phase of the church, because of course the church was then not an influential institution, but a relatively small, powerless community, acting, as it were, from below. And what's so extraordinary about the early church, which, as we know, expands very dramatically in a context often of persecution, and I'm an historian, there are many different accounts and explanations of why the church expands so vigorously. But what's often missed out is what the Christians themselves saw as what made them distinctive, which is beautifully brought out in this book by Alan Kreider called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, wonderful title, that actually there was a kind of what they call a habitus, a way of being that was scandalous and captivating at the same time to the pagan era. And that actually, if you look at the early church apologists like Cyprian and Tertullian, they would often talk about paciencia. It's much more than what we mean by patience. It's a willingness to live and to suffer in confident expectation of God's action. It's a mindset marked by the Beatitudes, which Francis, of course, constantly referred to as the heart of the gospel. So it's a way of being humble, peaceful, non-violent, not vengeful, not anxious or controlling, forgiving, generous, calm in adversity, but a way of relating above all to each other, which in a world which is, and you'll recognize by these adjectives, the world we're in increasingly now, that is essentially dominated by the technocratic world, dominated by the transactional relationships and domination and power and the power of tech and so on. It's very, very striking to live this way, to go the extra mile, not for your own gain, but because you're seeking to imitate how God is with us. So the church, Kreider says, doesn't actually spread primarily through missionary activity and great apologetics programs, but by contagion. It's because of its way of being, this non-violent, charitable, forgiving way of being, which is fascinating to those around. So if you look at Thomas Halleck's book, Afternoon of Christianity, he would say that this mindset, this way of relating, tells us better what people believe than the cognitive expression of the faith. And I think that is increasingly true for the way in which people now come to faith and come to the church. So it's a very different kind of as it were, religiosity that we're called to embody, that it's not so much we have the truth, we communicate that truth, we convince people, people come to faith in that way. but rather a way of being, hence also the way we treat migrants, the way we relate to creation, all these, as it were, communicates the heart of our faith so well. In other words, and these are all, of course, cultural questions. Now, Francis, in Quebec, particularly in 2022, talked about many of the ways in which this conversion might happen, returning to the initial proclamation, witnessing through the way we are, living fraternity too. I mean, above all, this idea that he embodied again in his phrase, todos, 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 everybody together, this idea of the capaciousness of the church, that everybody is welcome and is called to be part of this journey, that we don't have borders and so on, is at the heart of this synodal conversion. Here's another book cover. I've just finished this book. I've written a review for the tablet. Richard Rohr, he says it's his last book. I don't know whether you like Rohr. I've always been a huge fan. This is his final book, The Tears of Things. He says it's his final book, Prophetic Wisdom for an Age of Outrage. He has so many fascinating things he says here that are relevant to the synodal conversion. But just one thing he says which struck me, this famous phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast. He says, well, in many ways, culture eats religion for lunch. Our beliefs, our practices, the shape of our institutions are much more dominated by our surrounding cultural influences than what we like to believe. And of course, we live in a corporate age in which our church has so often embraced, as it were, a corporate, bureaucratic, authoritarian kind of way of being, which has done well for the church in a previous era in defending ourselves from an overweening state, but now is now counterproductive. In other words, it produces a reaction in people which is essentially negative. The first phase of the synod, when we were asking people about their experience of the church, time and time again, people talked about, referred to the way authority is exercised, the way that a certain kind of clericalism, the way priests and people relate to each other, the way people just aren't seen and recognized as they should be. There's this whole kind of sense, we were in Frascati reading these documents that came out of the bishops' conferences, and it was so striking how from wildly different countries these same notes kept being struck, and you kept thinking, gosh, there is something really important here that the Spirit is saying to the church. It's a sort of an awakening to the sense of dignity, of agency of the people, so this call to, as it were, to shed a culture which, as it were, no longer works. So I referred already to Thomas Halleck's book. Again, he's been in Australia recently. All the top people go to Australia sooner or later. And you may know this book well. I think it's probably the best description of this shift that we're called now to undergo. Just a little bit of evidence for this. And I'm not very good with statistics, so don't quote the statistics that I'm using here. But study after study, and particularly here, the Bible Society's done this very interesting study recently, show that the cultural Catholicism, the people who go to church, as it were, out of habit from childhood, as we know, dramatically shrinking. But at the same time, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been quite a strong uptick in people becoming Catholic, something like 40% since 2019 increase. It's quite remarkable. It may be a lot to do with COVID. But what's really striking is how so many of these people are coming not from a place of religion, but from a place of no faith, from agnosticism. They're the ones that Halleck calls the seekers and the searchers. And I've just come back from Rome, where I was at the fascinating Jubilee meeting of Catholic digital missionaries. We were addressed by Leo, I'll show you, where, again, somebody was talking about this in France, a French sister from Chemin Neuf, saying actually something like 70 or 80% of these people have contact, first of all, with the church or with faith through social media, through online people and so on. So we're dealing here with a very clear change and shift. And the question is how we move into this new era and what the implications of that are. Halleck would talk about fides qua versus fides quae. Synodality is essentially concerned with the fides qua. It's how we do things. Fides quae is what we believe. Synodality tends to take for granted what we believe and is concerned really with the change of how we do things. And again, Francis would constantly insist on this, that we're not people who primarily talk about God, but who resonate with the way that he relates to us. Theirs is a lived love that raises the question and calls for an answer. Why do you live like this? Why are you like this? And if I could just put this now to you, when we're talking about, as so many people do now, young people and the church and why are young people, how many young people do you, when you ask them about the church, essentially describe a corporation? That's how they would see it. Or the way that we go to church, going on Sunday as individuals and then returning from it, as if the service station model, one might say. You can see what they're saying is, how are you different? There's a critique in their question. And I think this is where synodality, as a school of conversion of our own way of doing things, is therefore so valuable. Dilexit Nos chapter 2, by the way, if you want to reflect on this, is rather wonderful in talking about what Anna was again talking about, how Jesus speaks to us, relates to us. And Francis himself, I spent so much of the papal transition talking about the impact that Francis had on the church. And I would constantly come back to the fact that he had this extraordinary gift of enabling people to be seen, recognized, understood, known. He awakened their sense of dignity. And you could see it so often, just watching him with people and the effect he had on people, those he met directly, but also, in a sense, on the whole church, which is why he called forth such a response following his death. And in a way, that is the effect that Jesus had, clearly, from the gospel, awakening people's sense of agency and of dignity. Through actions, words, and this thing called habitus. So as I just returned from Rome, this is yesterday morning. We were all in the Basilica, and Pope Leo came at the end of Mass, celebrated by Tagle, and addressed us. And that quote there is talking about something we all know. The technological shifts in our society have shaped not just the way we act, but the way we think. In other words, our culture right now is being shaped profoundly by the technological revolution, the digital revolution. And this demands, therefore, that the church, if we are not to be now completely shaped by this culture, we have to, and he puts there, reflect on the authenticity of our witness, on our ability to listen, to speak, and to speak, to our capacity to understand, and so on, to develop a way of thinking, to develop a language of our time that gives voice to love. So how do we generate encounter? All these are questions at the heart, I think, of the synodal journey. So there it is in the final document: asceticism, humility, patience, gratitude, to act without ambition, envy, or desire for domination or control. This is the kenosis that marks the Christian that we are, as a church, called now to embrace. Sorry to give you another book, but this is a really, I think, one of the best, perhaps the best, I think, book in English on synodality. It came out very recently by two people who have been very involved in the synod. And they have a whole chapter on, and it's the first time I've seen this in a book on synodality, on this conversion of relations, attitudes, and habits, what I call embracing God's style. 4 examples, how we learn to listen well, to speak well, how we learn to wait and to ponder, how we learn to journey together, to embrace diversity and live in tension. So much more to say about this, but I'm just leaving it with you to explore if you would like to. But it seems to me really key now that this is coming out. Another book, David Brooks, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. I love this book. It has nothing to do with the church, nothing to do with synodality, and yet it has everything. One of the things Brooks says in there, knowing a person, how there are people, he says, there are the people who, as it were, allow other people to feel seen and recognized, and others who, make you feel diminished and unseen. And he explores this in the book. What are these qualities? But one of the things he says that struck me very much is that most people who leave their jobs apparently do so not because they're not paid enough, although they often do obviously complain about that, but because they don't feel recognized and seen, or because they don't feel treated with dignity. Talk to people who no longer go to church. We lost in my diocese 1/3 of our congregants as a result of COVID. Ask them why they no longer come, and they say, we didn't think it would make any difference if we didn't come back. Nobody would miss us. In the final document, paragraph 50, just to highlight that one phrase, it's a wonderful paragraph that is worth reading in entirety, but just to highlight that one phrase: the evangelical quality of relationships in a community is decisive for the witness that the people of God are called to make in history. So another book. I've just translated this book, by the way. It's just come out, Messenger in Dublin, by Juan Guerrero, a Jesuit who has written this terrific book on conversation of the spirit. It's come out in lots and lots of languages, and we were very keen to have it out in English. And just talking there about the inner dispositions that the synodality teaches us. So, because I haven't got much time, to go back just briefly to Richard Rohr's book, and this is said so often by Francis in different ways, learning in synodality to wait trustfully, holding without panicking and anticipating, and to be able to hold these conflicts and paradoxes together in expectation of the Spirit's action is the key thing that, in a sense, is called to define the church in this change of era. Those who trust this process create a new future, while others just repeat the past over and over, living in this creative tension. The church is a complexio oppositorum. It's a way, it's a holding together of things which, as it were, in the world are in contradiction. And that restlessness, that tension is built into the church because it's what causes us to open ourselves up to the Spirit. We can't resolve these differences between us, simply by reason and by our own argument. We have to learn to listen and to hold these things in tension. And there in the document, and I love this, that they talk about the continuous articulation of polarities and tensions that structure the life of the church. Guess what? Within our church, we actually have these tensions built in, and they're not resolvable, by one side or another. They are fruitful and dynamic, and it says here, because they cause a restlessness that is missionary. I love this. This is very Francis. And they list a series of polarities there, right? Which, we just live with. We can add a whole lot of our own. The view of homosexuality between, Africa and Germany, which we saw in the Synod, the whole question of women, which no doubt we're going to get onto, ordained and ministries versus others. A whole load of tensions that we can add there, that in a sense we are called to live with and to embrace. And that's what synodality is, a school that enables us to do that. So here's the key I want to end with, a summary. Synodality is a journey, a way of journeying towards a church that is much more in God's style. And Rohr talks about all journeys of transformation. We start with order, and we don't wreck the order, we don't dismiss the order, we embrace the order, but we also move on from it through a healthy disorder, which results then in a reorder. We are in a time of transition into a new era where we need to be able to have a healthy disorder, to hold on to what is precious and valuable, but also to embrace what is new. And synodality is the means by which we learn to do this together, by which we acquire this new habitus, which is also, of course, a very old one, apostolic habitus needed to evangelize the era we are in. So synodal conversion, therefore, is the means of the gift of the Spirit that enables us to make this transition to what Halleck calls the afternoon of Christianity. Sorry if I went on. Thank you.